My name is Henry, and if you grew up in my family, you'd quickly learn that dinners weren't about eating together or bonding. They were about who could humiliate who the most. My relatives treated gatherings like battlegrounds where the only weapons were mockery, comparisons, and smug little remarks disguised as jokes. I'm 28 now, but I still remember being a kid at those Sunday dinners, sitting at the long oak table in my grandparents' house, listening to my Uncle Gerard hold court. He was my dad's older brother, a man who wore tailored suits even to a family barbecue and spoke to everyone like they worked for him. Gerard owned a mid-sized company back then, some sort of regional supplier business. To the rest of the family, he was the shining star, the self-made man, the one everyone held up as the standard. To me, he was the guy who looked me in the eye when I was 13 and said, "Henry, you're just not cut out for success. Stick to something simple." At the time, I was too young to understand how cruel that was. But it stuck. Every time I saw him, he'd find a way to slip in a jab about how I wasn't like my cousins. His son Mark, for instance, who was supposedly destined to inherit the business and carry the family name with pride. The funny part? I was never the kid who caused trouble. I wasn't loud. I wasn't disrespectful. I just liked keeping to myself, working on small projects, tinkering with ideas, reading things nobody else in the family cared about. But to Gerard, that was proof I was lazy or weak. The rest of the family didn't help much. My Aunt Muriel, Gerard's sister, was no better. She loved putting on this sweet tone when she spoke to me, but it always carried an edge. "Oh, Henry, still trying those little business experiments? Isn't it better to just get a real job? Security matters, dear." She'd smile as if she were worried about me, but everyone at the table knew she was twisting the knife. My parents? They never defended me. If anything, they'd nod along to Gerard's speeches, probably because they didn't want to be on the receiving end of his ridicule either. I learned to sit quietly, eat quickly, and leave as soon as possible. But over the years, the bitterness grew. I started building something on my own, quietly, in the background. A small business that at first looked like nothing. My family dismissed it entirely. When I mentioned it once, Gerard chuckled and said, "That sounds like a hobby, not a career." Muriel added, "Oh, Henry, you're so creative, but creativity doesn't pay the bills." Even my cousin Mark smirked, whispering loud enough for me to hear, "At least I'll never have to beg for a job." I stopped bringing it up after that. No point in giving them more ammunition. Years passed. My little hobby grew legs. While my relatives thought I was wasting time, I was working 14-hour days, reinvesting everything I earned, building connections with people who actually believed in innovation. I didn't make big announcements. I didn't brag. I just worked. Fast forward to a few weeks ago. My grandmother insisted on hosting another family dinner, and as much as I wanted to skip it, she's the only one in that house who ever treated me with real kindness. So I went. The second I walked in, I could tell nothing had changed. Gerard was already laughing at one of his own jokes. Muriel was seated with her nose in the air, and Mark greeted me with a limp handshake that dripped with superiority. I took a seat near the end of the table, trying to focus on the food and not the conversation. But of course, Gerard had to notice me. "Well, if it isn't Henry," he said, his voice booming across the table. "Tell us, what have you been doing with yourself these days? Still dabbling in those little side projects?" His words were coated in fake curiosity, but his grin made it clear what he really meant. I took a slow sip of water, trying not to rise to the bait. "I've been keeping busy," I said simply. "Busy?" Muriel repeated with a laugh, shaking her head. "That's such a vague answer. You must not have much to show if you can't be specific." Mark chimed in. "Probably still in that tiny apartment, right? Working on his hustles." He made air quotes, and everyone except my grandmother chuckled. I set my fork down, staring at my plate. For a moment, I thought about letting it go. It was easier, after all. Let them think what they wanted. But something in me snapped that night. Because the truth was, things had changed. A lot. I had quietly made moves none of them had any idea about. And sitting there, listening to Gerard hold court like he always did, I realized I didn't have to take it anymore. He leaned back in his chair, smirking at me. "Henry, let me give you some advice. Some men are meant to build, others are meant to follow. You're a follower. And there's no shame in that, unless you start pretending otherwise." The table erupted in laughter. I didn't laugh. I folded my napkin slowly, placed it beside my plate, and looked Gerard straight in the eye. And that's when I said it. Interesting, uncle. Considering I just bought your company. The laughter died instantly. Gerard's smirk vanished, replaced by a frown. Bought what company? The table went silent. Muriel's fork hovered in midair. Mark's mouth dropped open. My parents stared at me as if I'd just spoken another language. The room was so quiet you could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. For once, my Uncle Gerard didn't have the last word. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again, like he couldn't quite form a sentence. Bought what company? He repeated, slower this time. His voice had lost its usual booming confidence. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence stretch, because for the first time in years, I wasn't the one shrinking under the weight of their judgment. I was calm, steady, watching the cracks form in their carefully constructed superiority. My Aunt Muriel was the first to recover. She set her fork down with a sharp clink and leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Henry, are you joking? Please tell me you're not trying to embarrass yourself with some fantasy in front of everyone. I gave a small shrug. No joke. My cousin Mark snorted, though there was an edge of uncertainty in it. That's impossible. Dad's company isn't something you can just buy. You wouldn't even know where to start. I finally turned my gaze toward him. Funny you should say that. Turns out I knew exactly where to start. The tension at the table was growing heavier by the second. My parents sat frozen, my mother's hand hovering over her glass of water, my father avoiding my eyes altogether. They looked as though they'd been caught in the middle of a storm they never prepared for. Gerard leaned forward, his face turning red. You expect me to believe that you, of all people, managed to pull off something like this? No, you're bluffing. Why would I bluff? I asked evenly. It's already done. My grandmother, bless her, was the only one who didn't look horrified. Instead, she folded her hands gently in her lap and gave me the smallest nod of encouragement, as if she'd known all along I had more in me than the rest of them believed. But the others? They were spiraling. Henry, Muriel said sharply, her tone dripping with disdain. If this is some cruel attempt at humiliating your uncle, you should stop now before you make yourself look ridiculous. He has built something far beyond your reach. You wouldn't even understand the first step of a deal like that. Her words stung, but not in the way they once would have. They didn't make me feel small anymore. They just revealed how little she understood the world outside her own narrow circle. I set my elbows on the table, leaning slightly forward. That's where you're wrong, Aunt. I understood every step. I've been studying Gerard's company for years, its strengths, weaknesses, who his competitors were, and which contracts he was struggling to keep up with. I knew exactly when to move. And I moved. The look on Gerard's face was something I'll never forget. The man who once spoke to me like I was beneath him now sat staring as if he didn't recognize me at all. His jaw clenched, his knuckles white against the tablecloth. Mark tried again, but this time his voice cracked slightly. Even if you tried something, you wouldn't have the money. You're not. He stopped himself, swallowing hard. You're not in that league. Maybe you never paid attention to what I was doing, I said, my tone still measured. But that doesn't mean I wasn't building something real. While you were mocking me, I was working. I didn't need to be in your league, Mark. I created my own. My father finally spoke, his voice hoarse. Henry, is this true? I turned to him. Yes, every word. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand down his face. He looked more tired than surprised, as though he was realizing how badly he'd underestimated me all these years. My mother just sat rigid, her lips pressed into a thin line, eyes darting between me and Gerard. The air grew heavier by the second. No one reached for their food. No one dared move. Gerard slammed his hand on the table, making the dishes rattle. You think you're clever, don't you? You think you can just swoop in and undo everything I've built? You have no idea what you're dealing with. I didn't flinch. On the contrary, Uncle, I know exactly what I'm dealing with. And I made sure every step I took was legal, airtight, and irreversible. Muriel's face twisted with anger. This is disgraceful. To come here, to sit at this table, and to throw something like that in our faces, it's vile, Henry. Absolutely vile. I tilted my head. Vile? Or inconvenient? The silence that followed was deafening. My grandmother gently set her fork down, but her expression was almost serene, as if she'd been waiting years for this shift in the family dynamic. Mark muttered under his breath, "This can't be happening." But it was. I leaned back, folding my hands together calmly. You've all spent years laughing at me, dismissing me, treating me as though I was less than. Tonight, the only thing I did was tell you the truth. If you can't handle it, that's not my problem. Gerard's eyes narrowed into slits, his face a deep shade of red. If what you say is true, then you've made yourself an enemy you'll regret having. Gerard slammed his fists on the table again, not loud enough to startle my grandmother, but loud enough that everyone flinched. He looked like a man who'd just found out the ground he'd been standing on had been quietly removed. I felt a calm heat inside me, the kind that comes from months of planning finally meeting the moment it was meant for. Regret, I echoed. Uncle, I don't want you to regret me personally. I want you to regret the choices you made that put you in a position where someone like me could step in and clean up the mess. The table erupted into shocked murmurs. Muriel's lips thinned until they were almost invisible. Mark's face had drained of color. My parents' expressions were complicated: shame, bewilderment, a trace of pride that made me feel guilty for a second, then vanish when I remembered the years of belittling. Clean up the mess? Gerard spat the words as if they were poison. This is my company. I built it from the ground up. I'm the reason any of you had opportunities. You built an empire on short-term wins and cutting corners, I said softly. On safe contracts that kept clients comfortable, but you let long-term deals rot. You bought flashy machinery instead of maintaining relationships. You rewarded loyalty with lectures and punished dissent with silence. That's not a foundation, it's a house of cards. And it's the sort of thing my partners and I look for. Not because we want to destroy, but because we know how to fix. Silence took the room again. Granny reached for my hand under the table and squeezed. Her knuckles were warm and trembling, like she was holding on to something she'd been afraid to say out loud for years. How did you even? Mark started, then stopped. He had no script for this. I let them stew a moment longer. Then I outlined, in plain terms, everything they already suspected and refused to admit. The company had been underperforming for 3 years. Wages had been stretched thin to hide shortfalls. A few key contracts were up for renewal, and the other side had been quietly courting competitors. I described the meeting I'd had with 2 of Gerard's longtime clients, how I'd listened to them talk about broken promises and missed deliveries, and how I'd offered them a clean slate under a new ownership structure. I mentioned the small group of investors who believed in my approach, people who saw value where Gerard saw vanity. I told them, without flourish, that we'd bought enough shares quietly over the last 12 months to present a legitimate offer, and when board oversight failed to act, shareholders accepted. Every sentence seemed to puncture a part of Gerard's armor. He hunched forward, his tie limp, the confident posture gone. For the first time I saw someone who'd been immune to consequences actually confronted by them. It was not a beautiful sight. It was, however, necessary. You lied to us, Muriel accused. You sat at this table and pretended to be one of us while you were plotting to steal from family. It wasn't theft, I said. It was a legal acquisition. There's a difference between stealing and recognizing value that the original owner no longer appreciates. I didn't take anything that wasn't available for purchase. You all had every opportunity to save the company or support it. Instead, you mocked it and me. My father cleared his throat. Was there any foul play? Any backdoor deals with creditors? Have you looked into the loans? He sounded like a man trying to hold 2 truths at once. The family myth that Gerard could do no wrong, and the dawning realization that maybe he had. I did my due diligence, I said. My team and I brought in accountants and lawyers. We didn't act on rumors. We acted on numbers and contracts. We reached out to employees individually, not to poach, but to promise stability. When the board ignored a request to address liquidity issues, shareholders responded. That last part was the hinge. Gerard's nostrils flared. You went behind my back to the shareholders? You connived with outsiders to take what You let things go for years, I interrupted. You refused to replace a failing COO because he was a friend. You laughed off maintenance requests because the quarterly reports looked good. You prioritized ego over survival. I didn't take your company. You abandoned it. In the sudden hush, Mark looked at his father as if expecting him to retort with the usual abrasion, the comeback that would belittle and dismiss. When it didn't come, Mark's face folded into something like dread. The conversation ended abruptly when my uncle pushed back from the table so hard his chair skidded. He stood with all the theatrical indignation he'd rehearsed 100 times but never actually had to play. You think you can just walk into my life and rearrange everything? I'll have lawyers. I'll call everyone. You'll see. This will be overturned. Call lawyers, I said, and my voice was ice simple. You are welcome to try. We have paperwork. We have shareholders' approvals. We have binding contracts. Legal challenges are expected. That's why the acquisition was structured to withstand them. He left before dessert. Not a slow exit to collect himself. An eye-level, slammed door, fist on the car hood, kind of departure that left the house breathing heavily. The family followed him like an afterthought, the kind of loyalty born of proximity rather than affection. Only Granny stayed, and she nodded at me, the small motion of a woman who'd witnessed seasons change and knew which ones would be bitter and which would be bearable. After he was gone, the rest of the night unfolded like a play where everyone tried to act normal. Conversations resumed on safe topics. The weather, a new neighbor, but every sentence was edged with the knowledge that nothing had stayed the same. I sat and listened to the polite cruelty and the disguised concern, and a small part of me mourned the years lost. But a larger part of me felt vindicated. Validation is not the same as revenge, but it clears the path to it. Revenge, to me, was never about spectacle. I didn't want to humiliate Gerard with a viral video or a dramatic monologue on the front steps of the company. I wanted to dismantle the structures that allowed him to mistreat people while keeping the appearance of competence. I wanted accountability. And in that, I had a plan that would be slow, surgical, and utterly public in its finality. That night, back in my apartment, I opened the dossier I'd kept in a locked drawer for months. It was thick with copies of emails, vendor notices, delayed maintenance work orders, HR complaints that had been ignored, and financial statements that, when read in sequence, told a very different story than the one at family dinners. I had names of managers who'd been sidelined for speaking up and testimonies from clients who'd been ghosted. I had contracts showing penalties Gerard had somehow overlooked, and those penalties added up. I didn't send everything at once. That would be satisfyingly cruel but counterproductive. Instead, I began with small moves designed to probe and to pressure. The first was internal, a quiet conversation with the HR director, Maria, a woman who'd been overlooked for a promotion for years because she'd dared to suggest reforms. She met me for coffee a week after the acquisition closed, her hands wrapped around a mug like an anchor. "You're not here to run me out, are you?" she asked, suspicion braided with exhaustion. "I'm here to give you a seat at the table," I told her. "I want to know what's been happening, what people are afraid to say, and who needs protection. I want the truth, even if it hurts." Maria's eyes softened. She told me about teams who worked double shifts without overtime, about a supplier that had been paid late so Gerard could buy a new executive car, about a safety inspection that had been delayed because spending on repairs was frowned upon. She gave me documents and names, and, most importantly, a list of people who would testify if asked. Next came the clients. I didn't threaten them. I apologized. I offered solutions. I promised a different leadership and then followed through with immediate action, reinstating missed deliveries, waiving fees where Gerard's mismanagement had cost them money, assigning senior personnel to manage key contracts. Within weeks, one disgruntled former client became an advocate. Another scheduled a meeting to renegotiate terms, this time with my team in the room. Meanwhile, public perception mattered. I carefully crafted a message for employees and stakeholders: stability, transparency, and a commitment to fixing problems that had been ignored. I made sure the message wasn't aggressive. It was competent. It was precise. That competence, more than anything, began to erode Gerard's legend among the company's clients and partners. People noticed a difference in months, not years, and they liked what they saw. Back at home, though, the family's reaction evolved into something different and more corrosive than I expected. There were whispered conversations when I arrived at another gathering. Invitations became tentative. Muriel tried to buy allies with passive-aggressive civility. Mark retreated into resentment and blunt questions. Gerard called once, a cold, clipped conversation where he warned me that I'd harvested a field I didn't understand. He threatened legal action and reputation damage. He sent emails to former colleagues with insinuations about my methods. I let his words bounce harmlessly off the armor of documents and legal counsel I'd assembled. That was when I escalated. Not with drama, with structure. I called a meeting with the executive team for the following Tuesday, and instead of storming in as the new owner, I sent a short, measured message. We needed to audit operations, prioritize employee safety, and begin immediate remediation on the most critical client contracts. I requested their cooperation and their honesty. The reply was mixed. Some were relieved, others fearful. On Monday evening, 2 days before the planned meeting, I received an anonymous package at my office. Inside was a folder of internal memos that corroborated much of what Maria had told me, including a note showing Gerard had been warned about a supplier issue that eventually cost the company a major contract. The sender had left a simple line: "We were ignored." It was a soft plea and a loud indictment at the same time. Whoever sent it wanted the company fixed, not the drama of a scandal. At the Tuesday meeting, I presented the audit plan and the remediation schedule. I didn't gloat. I didn't taunt. I was methodical, almost tedious with the details, because details win where theatrics falter. When I laid out the sequence that led to their biggest contract loss, a silence fell that was heavier than any family dinner. Heads nodded, pens scratched. A few executives who had been complicit in covering things up shifted uncomfortably. After the meeting, while people filed out, the COO, the friend Gerard had protected, pulled me aside. "You're making enemies," he said quietly, not an accusation but a fact. "I'm making accountability," I replied. He left without another word. Later that day, a letter arrived. Gerard had filed for an injunction claiming the acquisition had been procured by fraud. It was the move I expected and had planned for. Lawyers for both sides took their positions like chess pieces. Media murmurs began to stir. A regional business news column dug into the story, asking for comment. I provided measured, fact-based statements. The narrative began to tilt. Competence versus ego, stewardship versus neglect. At home, the family fracture widened. My parents were torn between loyalty to blood and the new, undeniable truth that perhaps they'd supported the wrong man. Muriel staged small confrontations, trying to accuse me of betrayal. Mark stopped speaking to me entirely. Our few interactions were thin and formal. Gerard alternated between public bluster and private pleadings through intermediaries. And then came the call that changed everything. Not a legal move, not a public statement, but a small, cruelly personal gambit that told me exactly how cornered Gerard felt. He'd sent an old family friend, someone who'd been like an uncle to me, to ask me to settle, to make amends so the family could be spared scandal. The friend's voice trembled as he described Gerard's desperation. He implied eldercare considerations, legacy, the way a man wants to be remembered. It was an attempt to weaponize sentiment. It almost worked, but I had already decided that this was not about vengeance for one humiliation at a dinner table. This was about protecting people who had been sidelined by Gerard's pride. The employees, the clients, the managers who had been dismissed for pointing out rot. I told the friend plainly that nostalgia did not absolve harm, and that if Gerard wanted to negotiate a dignified exit, the company would offer fair terms. Not silence, not adoration, just fair terms and an expectation of accountability. When I told my parents what I'd said, they recoiled. "You sound cruel," my mother whispered. "You're fighting a war with family." "I'm trying to save jobs," I answered. "I'm trying to fix something you all loved because you believed in the image more than the practice." The next morning, Gerard's lawyer called my counsel and demanded an emergency injunction to freeze the board's decisions until the court reviewed the acquisition paperwork. The language was precise, the tone all business. My legal team, confident and prepared, filed the appropriate counters. Lawyers began to tower over the story like gray clouds. The court date was set for 2 weeks out. In the meantime, whispers turned to headlines, and the company, once Gerard's fortress, became a place of cautious waiting. It was in that waiting room, while the legal gears began to grind, that I decided the next step. The injunction could slow us. It could create noise. It could, if handled correctly, highlight the very issues I wanted addressed. So I made a choice. I would not only defend the acquisition legally, but I would make the company's problems impossible to ignore. I slated a public briefing for investors and clients, not a PR stunt, but a transparent disclosure of the audit findings and the remediation plan. I invited the press. I invited long-ignored stakeholders. I invited anyone with a right to know. It was bold. It was risky. It was necessary. That evening, as I sat drafting the press release, my phone buzzed. The caller ID showed an unknown number at first, then a number I recognized, Gerard's cell. I didn't answer. He left a message instead, terse and raw. He wanted a private meeting that night. He said there were things I didn't understand about the company, about the board, about the obligations that couldn't be fixed by kids with money. He asked for mercy in one breath and threatened me in the next. I listened to the message twice and felt my pulse steady. Then I did something I hadn't planned to do. I called him back. We met 10 minutes later in the driveway outside my grandmother's house, the same place where he'd stormed out 2 nights before. His car idled with the engine off, like he'd deliberately killed it, so the conversation could not be overheard by anything but the night. He looked exhausted and smaller than the man who'd once dominated any room. "You don't have to make this personal," he started. "I already did," I said. "When you spoke of me as lesser for years, when you dismissed my work and my worth, you made it personal. I didn't start this. You did." He clenched his jaw. "If you go public with the audit, you'll destroy what little reputation we have left. People will lose confidence. Employees will leave. You'll be responsible for wrecking people's lives." "I'm responsible for fixing them," I replied. "And if people choose to leave because of how things were run, I would rather have a smaller, honest company than a larger, dishonest one." He stared at me for a long moment, something like pity crossing his features, then hardened. "You were always clever with numbers and words, Henry. But there are things you don't get about legacy. Legacy isn't about being adored," I said. "It's about being remembered as someone who didn't bankrupt others for his ego." He laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You and I will see whose legacy endures." He turned to his car, then paused. "One more thing," he said, in a voice that didn't belong to the man who'd left dinner in a storm. "If your paper trail is so airtight, how do you explain the loan guarantee I signed on behalf of the company 3 years ago? If creditors call that in, everyone, you included, could be in serious trouble." For the first time since I'd announced the purchase, I felt a genuine unease. It was a legal landmine I'd known about but hoped would stay dormant. The guarantee was a complex instrument. If creditors had grounds to accelerate, it could cause immediate liquidity problems. I met his gaze. He looked like a man who'd just drawn a line in the sand and dared me to cross it. Behind him, the house lights glowed through the windows where family members slept unaware of the next chess move. "You think that will stop me?" I asked softly. "You think a threat like that will keep me from pressing forward?" He hesitated. For a sliver of a second, I saw the old man behind the bravado, tired, frightened, clinging to control. Then the mask returned. "You'll find out," he said. I could have answered. I could have promised restraint, or mercy, or legal counters. Instead, I turned and walked away, my mind already mapping legal paths, contingency plans, and public strategies. The board needed to be informed, clients reassured, and the press prepared. The creditors, if they were roused, would be negotiated with or litigated. Every reaction had a counter, every threat a response. As I climbed the porch steps, my phone vibrated with a message from Maria. "There's something else. Meet me tomorrow morning. Bring your lawyer." I stopped mid-step. The night had just gotten sharper. The game had changed. Gerard had threatened a nuclear option, and someone on the inside had more to reveal. I read Maria's message again. The porch light flickered. The house behind me was quiet. Inside, arrangements for the legal fight were taking shape. Outside, the southern sky hinted at dawn. And I knew, with a clarity that felt like both relief and dread, that the next 48 hours would decide more than just a company's future. They would decide whether a family's myth could survive the truth, and whether the people who had been silenced would finally be heard. I put my key in the lock, paused, and didn't go inside. I sat on the steps and stared at the street, thinking about the long list of slights and the cold, slow work of undoing them. The sound of a car in the distance reminded me that nothing about this would be quiet for long. 2 words popped into my head: exposure and repair. One would burn, the other would build. I had to choose how quickly to burn and how deeply to build. Before I could make that call, my phone buzzed again, this time with a forwarded email from an unknown sender. The subject line read, "Confidential, board minutes, and loan guarantee details attached." I froze. My stomach became a small, tight knot. The document preview showed a scanned page with signatures I recognized. My thumb hovered over the file. I stared at the scanned page until the words blurred. Gerard's signature, the company's seal, and a clause that read like an admission. I won't pretend it wasn't a punch to the gut. 3 years earlier, in a cash flow pinch, Gerard had personally guaranteed a line of credit to keep an important supplier afloat. The board minutes next to it didn't read like a defense. They read like willful omission. The minutes showed the board had been warned that liquidity was precarious, that certain contracts were at risk unless management repaired relationships and adjusted payment schedules. The minutes also showed the board, Gerard included, voted to defer serious fixes for another quarter. That clause changed everything. If creditors tried to accelerate the debt and called in the guarantee, it wouldn't just put the company at risk. It could put Gerard personally on the hook. The nuclear option he'd threatened with an offhand comment at the driveway suddenly had a face. I called my lawyer at midnight and forwarded the file. I called Maria and told her to be ready at 8 with everything else she had. I slept the way you do when your brain keeps busy, in fits, with tabs of contingencies open in the back of my mind. The next morning, the first thing I did was tell myself to slow down. The cagey moves, the traps, they all hinged on timing and clarity, not vengeful theatrics. My legal team put together a response to Gerard's injunction that was meticulous, unflashy, and damning in the way only cold documents can be. We attached the board minutes, supplier notices, emails where Gerard dismissed warnings as temporary blips, and the bank's loan agreement with Gerard's guarantee highlighted. We filed an emergency motion asking the court not to freeze board actions, and we asked the judge to consider whether Gerard's own management decisions had created the instability he now claimed had been engineered by me. At the same time, I set another axis of pressure into motion: transparency. 2 days before the hearing, I sent a carefully worded memo to employees, clients, and a short list of stakeholders, including major creditors. No accusations, no gloating, just the facts, the audit findings, the remediation plan, and an offer to meet with anyone who needed reassurances. I included an invitation to a public briefing after the court hearing, promising nothing theatrical, only evidence of a path forward. There are 2 things I learned quickly. 1, people respect competence more than rhetoric. 2, nobody likes being left in the dark. Once the clients saw a concrete plan, who would manage their accounts, timelines for recovered deliveries, and offer to waive past penalties where we'd failed them, they started answering my messages with sentences I'd never heard from the same people when Gerard ran the show. Thank you for reaching out. This looks promising. We'll give you a chance to prove it. It didn't erase the losses, but it bought breathing room. The court date felt like a weather front. Gerard's lawyers argued loudly that the acquisition was a hostile takeover built on deception. They painted me as the boogeyman who preyed on a family business. My lawyers responded with documents and depositions, emails showing the board's failure to act, testimony from long-term employees about ignored warnings, and the shareholders' vote records. We were asking the judge to see the acquisition not as theft, but as a remedy for governance failure. We also put the loan guarantee on the table with an argument that if Gerard wanted to call in the lenders, they should be the ones to weigh the consequences of subjecting the company to forced liquidation, something creditors rarely wanted. The hearing lasted a morning. It was tense and procedural and utterly bureaucratic, exactly the kind of thing that favored the party with better organization and integrity. Ultimately, the judge denied Gerard's emergency injunction. He was not exonerated. The court made clear that the merits would be decided later. But for the immediate term, the company remained under the new board's authority. That was the hinge I'd built my plan on. Within 24 hours of the ruling, the press that had sniffed around began to write in a tone that didn't always favor my uncle. The narrative shifted from family feud to management failure and rescue. Headlines don't fix factories or outstanding invoices, but they do move people. Creditors, who had been receiving Gerard's agitation, suddenly wanted to talk to me. We arranged a meeting with the primary lender. Sitting across from a senior banking officer in a glass conference room, I laid out the remediation plan: restructure the problematic supplier contracts, reassign several managers who'd been protecting the status quo, institute a temporary cash sweep to guarantee core deliveries, and deploy a small bridge loan from our investors to handle short-term liquidity. I didn't plead. I didn't promise miracles. I showed projections and named the team who would deliver. The bank's rep was a pragmatic person. "We don't want to take it over," she said. "If you can show us wins in 60 days, we'll be much more inclined to support a restructuring rather than accelerate." Her voice was not merciful, it was transactional. That was all we needed. We gave her the timelines, the payment waterfalls, the names of the senior managers now accountable, and the bank agreed to a covenant amendment that kept the guarantee in effect but prevented an immediate acceleration unless clear thresholds were missed. It wasn't a total victory. Guarantees are dangerous in the wrong hands. But the lenders preferred value over drama, and that preference was enough for them to step back from a nuclear move. I bought time, exactly what we needed to deliver wins. Back home, the family's reaction became readable like a worn map, patterns repeated with slight variation. Muriel called to demand explanations. She accused me, again, of betrayal. She used phrases like legacy, shame, and family reputation, as if those things were currency that could override harm. Mark sent curt messages through his mother that stopped at insults that were more sorrowful for their limpness than for any real bite. Gerard, now more volatile, alternated between blistering emails and imploring intermediaries to settle this before it destroys the family name. He tried one last attempt to weaponize mutual acquaintances, to get board members to join him. The people who'd once bowed to his charm were now reading documents and making calculations. I didn't take pleasure in the slow unraveling of his narrative. Vindication felt too small a word. The rest of the company's board, some members who'd been complicit, some who'd been passive, began to align with the restoration plan. People who'd been ignored were being asked what they'd need to do their jobs properly. We began rehiring temporarily displaced technicians and negotiating with suppliers on terms that would guarantee delivery without sacrificing cash flow. Then Maria showed me a file I hadn't seen, a whistleblower packet from someone in procurement that documented kickbacks and improper vendor selection dating back 5 years. This was not only negligent governance, it edged into malfeasance. We shared the material with an independent auditor and the law firm handling the litigation. The packet didn't make me gloat. It made me grim. It placed Gerard squarely in the center of a set of decisions that had prioritized appearances and short-term profit over employees, clients, and long-term sustainability. When the story hit that level, where mismanagement bordered on ethical breaches, Gerard's public posture collapsed. He gave a press interview that was clumsy and defensive. He tried to cast himself as a scapegoat for market forces and blamed a hostile cabal. The more he spoke, the more the narrative hardened against him. People who had once smiled and nodded now refused interviews and asked for their own positions to be secured before any rollback. The company's customers sent letters requesting guarantees and changes in management, requests we accepted and implemented. There was a kind of justice in how he fell. It was not cinematic, and it was not instantaneous. It was ledgered and logged, audited and reformed. The executive team was reshuffled. Competent managers were promoted. The COO, who had been a hand-picked friend of Gerard's, was placed on leave pending an internal investigation, and HR was empowered. We implemented transparent procurement processes, publicized our vendor selection criteria, and rolled out a short-term employee bonus structure to repair years of underpayment and oversight. We added an employee advisory board and set up a hotline for complaints with independent oversight. I made a choice early on to let actions speak louder than insults. So rather than parade Gerard's missteps like trophies, I fixed the things that mattered to the people who actually kept the company running. When deliveries resumed and invoices were paid reliably, when employees could plan paychecks instead of holding their breath, the company stabilized. The market noticed. As the weeks turned into months, Gerard's options narrowed. Legal actions he pursued slowed the company, but did not reverse the court's direction. Depositions made public things he'd rather have kept private, and shareholders who had been swayed by his charisma found themselves voting with the ledger. The man who once stood at the head of family tables as if he were carved from marble now took phone calls from collectors and invocations of guarantees. His credit lines changed. His social circle thinned. Family life, predictably, fractured. Muriel tried to organize a public reconciliation at my grandmother's birthday, but Granny shut it down with one look. Mark, who had once expected to inherit both the business and the spotlight, found himself unemployed and stripped of the promise he'd been raised on. He tried to call me thrice that December. I let the calls show as missed. I didn't answer because whatever small echo of brotherhood that had existed between us had been drowned by his years of ridicule. He had chosen his side, and his side had chosen posture over people. People asked me if it felt like revenge. I used to think revenge was a red, theatrical thing. Public humiliation, a viral scandal, the dramatic collapse on the front steps. But the revenge that satisfied me was quieter. Payrolls honored, suppliers paid on time, safety issues fixed, lines of communication restored. The company survived. The people who had been mistreated were no longer sidelined. The man who'd used a dinner table as a stage for tearing people down lost his audience because the audience finally saw proof he hadn't been building anything sustainable. There was the legal closure as well. In the civil suits that followed, the internal audits and procurement investigations became the backbone of a settlement for shareholders and clients who'd suffered losses under the previous regime. Gerard settled several claims quietly in exchange for an agreed resignation package that included a clause preventing him from making public statements that could be considered defamatory. It was not generous. It was pragmatic. His net worth took a hit, and his reputation among peers dwindled. He sold a lakeside property to cover several settlements. The price he paid was not purely financial. He was estranged and, more importantly, exposed. Muriel tried for pity in public, invoking family loyalty and the strain of what we'd built. That line failed where it had once succeeded because people could now see decades of decisions laid out on paper. Mark's prospects were dim. He applied for jobs and was rejected in interviews when background checks turned up the story about his lack of involvement and management experience. He landed a position at a small firm far from home, the sort of job that didn't come with invitations to weddings or boardrooms. He called once on a holiday and left a message that was part apology and part explanation. I never called back. My parents came to visit the office once we had steady processes in place. My father shook my hand like a man who'd been handed a mirror and didn't like what he saw. He said, quietly, "You did good, son." My mother didn't say much, but she met my eye, and it was the first time she'd looked at me like I wasn't that shy boy at the end of the table. People wanted to know if I forgave them. I didn't. Not then, not now. Forgiveness, in my view, would suggest that their behavior was an accident or forgivable oversight. It wasn't. It was conscious, repeated, and corrosive. There would be no family comes together by the fireplace, homecoming. We were reduced to polite nods at the one funeral in the family that felt real, my grandmother's. Even that event was strained, weighty, and stripped of theatricality. Muriel sat across from me and did not try to make amends. She simply looked tired, and I felt only the residue of what had been. What I did do was set boundaries. Gerard's attempts to engage in petty sabotage, anonymous letters, leaked claims about our financing, were countered with facts and legal notice. When he tried to use mutual acquaintances to undermine our client relationships, we addressed each issue transparently. When Muriel tried to arrange a smear through neighborhood channels, the people she thought she could manipulate didn't listen. Sound systems and reputations, once built with charm and bluster, can be dismantled by steadiness and transparency. Today, the company is stable and recovering. We rehired a third of the staff who had left during the worst months, and we instituted an employee stock ownership plan so people who rebuilt the company had a stake in its future. Revenue grew slowly, predictably, and, importantly, ethically. We repaired major client relationships, and a few of Gerard's old loyalists who saw the company thrive under competent leadership reached out to thank me privately. Those conversations were not reconciliations. They were acknowledgments that things had been broken under Gerard's tenure. Legally, the acquisition held. The injunction was dissolved. Gerard's countersuits were either dismissed or settled on terms that left him diminished. He no longer ran the company. He no longer dominated the family room. He tried to visit Granny once after the dust settled, but she received him with a dignity that felt like a verdict. His pleas fell on the floor between them like paper. He moved out of the lakeside house within a year, and the community that once applauded his arrival stopped responding to invitations. What I did not do was rub salt. I didn't show up at family gatherings to gloat. I refused television cameras or sensational outlets when they asked for the dramatic fall. My revenge had never been about spectacle. It had been about righting wrongs and making sure that people who had been treated as expendable received the stability they deserved. In the end, the situation was this. The company survived and is on a steady path to recovery under new, accountable leadership. Day-to-day operations are healthier. Employees have clearer channels for reporting issues, better pay transparency, and ownership stakes. Gerard resigned and settled multiple claims. Financially diminished and socially marginalized, he now lives a quieter life, with a smaller circle and fewer invitations. He is a cautionary example in our town for how charisma can hide rot. Muriel and Mark lost social standing and opportunities. Muriel's attempts to salvage her image failed. She spends her energy on small charity committees where she's less visible. Mark works at a modest firm far from where our family sits at its old table. My parents are distant, but no longer complicit in Gerard's myth-making. They visit rarely and speak carefully. Granny lived just long enough to see some measure of justice and died with a small, private smile the day the company signed a major contract we'd salvaged. I'm in a position of ownership and responsibility I never sought for glory. I work longer hours than I did when I was tinkering in my apartment, not because I enjoy it, but because I feel accountable. I never forgave them in the sense of reconciliation. I forgave myself for letting their words define me for so long, and I reclaimed the narrative by doing the work. If you're asking whether I feel triumphant, yes, in the way of a person who watched something fragile and valuable near collapse and helped pull it back. If you're asking whether I feel settled, no. There are nights I think about the boy who folded his napkin and said 3 words that changed everything. There are mornings I wake before the office opens, drink coffee in silence, and think about how tenuous any legacy really is. The family dinners are over for me. If I go home to visit, it is to see Granny's favorite chair or to speak with someone who needs help, not to play the old game of humiliation and quiet endurance. The people who mistreated us remained villains in my ledger, in their actions, in their priorities, and in the choices they made. They were punished in ways both public and private. Diminished trust, financial penalties, and the slow erosion of the social capital they once wielded as armor. I have no desire to rub their faces in it. I have a company to run, people to protect, and a ledger of repairs to keep. Revenge, in truth, tasted best when it was paired with repair, when the company was steadied, when paychecks arrived on time, when injured suppliers were paid, when the people who had been sidelined could look forward again. Sometimes, when the office is quiet late at night, I imagine a future where we're not defined by the mess Gerard made. I imagine employees telling their kids they work at a company that was turned around by someone who cared. That's the revenge I wanted, not some theatrical ruin, but the slow rebuilding of what was broken. So that's what happened. The villains were exposed, they were held accountable, and they are no longer the center of the story. The company lives. The employees breathe easier. The family, for the most part, is fractured and largely silent. I didn't forgive them in the way people sometimes expect. I didn't take pleasure in their fall. I took responsibility for what I could fix, and that was enough. Thanks for watching. I'm Joe, I'm 32, and if you had told me 5 years ago that my entire family would implode over a single conversation in our childhood kitchen, I would have laughed. My family has always been dramatic, my mom in particular, but what happened that night went beyond drama. It was years of secrets, manipulation, and lies collapsing in one awful, almost cinematic moment. And the worst part? I didn't even see it coming. To explain how it got there, I have to start with what my family used to be, or at least, what I thought we were. I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania, the middle child between my older brother, Daniel, and my younger sister, Chloe. My dad passed away when I was 15, which left Mom in charge of everything. The bills, the house, the 3 of us. She always reminded us of that, how much she sacrificed for us. At the time, I believed it. She was strict, sure, but I thought that's just how moms were after losing their husbands. What I didn't realize back then was that control had become her way of coping, and her version of love was more like possession. Daniel was her favorite. She never said it out loud, but you could feel it in the air. He could crash her car, and she'd say, "He's just under stress." I could forget to mow the lawn, and it'd be, "You never do anything right." Chloe, the youngest, learned early on that staying quiet kept her out of trouble. She was sweet but nervous, like she was always waiting for something to explode. I used to protect her as much as I could, but as we got older, I moved out, and Mom's grip tightened on whoever was left. By the time I hit 30, I had built a decent life. I worked in IT, rented a nice apartment in Pittsburgh, and only saw my family during holidays. I kept my visits short. Mom had a way of turning every conversation into a guilt trip. If I didn't call for a week, she'd say things like, "I could be dead and you wouldn't even know." Or, "Daniel always finds time for his mother." That last one always hit a nerve. Daniel had taken over Dad's old workshop after college, and Mom practically worshipped him for it. He could do no wrong. I tried to ignore the favoritism, but it got harder when she started involving money. See, Dad left a small inheritance. Nothing crazy, but enough to help each of us start our lives. Mom handled it, until we were responsible. Years later, Daniel somehow got access to his portion early to expand his business, while Chloe and I were told ours was still tied up in savings. Every time I asked about it, Mom brushed it off. "You wouldn't understand, Joe. Investments take time." I didn't push, because honestly, I didn't want to start another fight. Then, about a year ago, Chloe called me out of the blue. She rarely did that unless something was wrong. She sounded nervous, whispering like she was afraid someone might hear. "Joe," she said, "did Mom ever give you your share from Dad's will?" I told her no, and she went quiet for a long time before saying, "I think Daniel got all of it." I didn't want to believe her. Daniel and I didn't always get along, but I didn't think he'd steal from us. Still, Chloe wasn't the type to make things up. She told me she'd seen some old bank papers in Mom's office that mentioned a trust liquidation in Daniel's name. When she asked Mom about it, Mom got defensive, said she was confused and misreading private documents. That was the first real crack in the story I'd believed for years. The next time I visited home, I decided to bring it up. It was a Sunday afternoon, and Daniel was in the garage fixing something on his truck. Mom was at the kitchen table clipping coupons, the same way she always did. I sat across from her and tried to sound calm. "Mom, I wanted to ask you about Dad's inheritance." She froze mid-snip, but didn't look up. "What about it?" she said flatly. I told her what Chloe had seen. Her hands started to shake, but her tone stayed eerily steady. "You two need to stop gossiping about things you don't understand." I pressed again, asking why Daniel got his share, but we didn't. That's when she slammed the scissors down and snapped. "Because Daniel needed it. He's the only one who does anything with his life. You and Chloe just waste your time." That hit harder than I expected. I left not long after, with her voice still ringing in my ears. I didn't talk to her for 2 months after that. But then, around Thanksgiving, Daniel called me. "Mom's planning something," he said, sounding oddly tense. "She wants us all home for Christmas. Says it's important." I almost said no. I wasn't in the mood for one of her guilt-fueled family gatherings, but something in his voice made me pause. Daniel rarely sounded nervous about Mom. When Christmas came, I drove back down, mostly for Chloe's sake. She was still living at home, saving for grad school. When I arrived, Mom was different, too cheerful. She greeted me with this tight smile, almost like she was rehearsing being kind. The whole house smelled like cinnamon candles and roast beef, but under that was this strange tension I couldn't shake. Dinner started off normal enough. Daniel talked about some new deal he was working on. Mom bragged about how proud she was, and Chloe barely spoke. Then, about halfway through, Mom stood up and said she had a surprise. She disappeared into her office and came back holding a box of old papers. "I found something special while cleaning," she said. "Your father's old files." Daniel leaned forward immediately. "What files?" Mom smiled. "Just some things about the estate. I thought it'd be nice to look back." My stomach twisted. Chloe looked pale. I think both of us realized what was about to happen. Mom started pulling out papers, copies of the will, bank statements, all of it. She laid them out like it was some kind of family show and tell. "See here," she said, tapping one of the documents. "Your father wanted what was best for all of you. And that's exactly what I did." Daniel frowned, scanning the papers. His face started to lose color. "Wait," he said, his voice tight. These are from my account." He looked up at her, confused. "You've been hiding this from me all along." That's when I realized he didn't know either. He didn't know she'd manipulated all of us, even him. Before I could say anything, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around and saw Mom at the door, standing perfectly still, her face lit by the soft yellow light from the hallway. She was smiling, this strange, almost satisfied smile. Then she said, quietly but clearly, "Well, since you're all here." For a moment, no one said anything. The room was too quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the old clock above the stove. Mom's words hung in the air like smoke. Since you're all here, what did she mean by that? I looked at Chloe. Her face had gone completely still, eyes darting between Daniel and Mom. Mom stepped further into the room, the papers in her hand like a deck of cards she was about to deal. I think it's time, she said, her tone almost casual, that we talk about some truths. You've all been so suspicious lately, sneaking around my office, whispering behind my back. Her gaze landed on Chloe. You think I don't notice? I notice everything in this house. Chloe's lips parted, but no sound came out. I could tell she was fighting the urge to cry. Daniel looked tense, confused. Mom, he said carefully, what exactly are we talking about? She set the papers down on the table, smoothing them out with her fingers. Your father's estate, the house, the savings, the things that have apparently become such a fascination for you three. Because you lied to us, I said before I could stop myself. My voice came out sharper than I intended. You told us everything was locked away in savings. Chloe saw the paperwork. Daniel got his share years ago. You told her she was wrong. So which is it? Mom's smile faltered just slightly before returning, tighter now. You think you understand what it's like to manage a household after your husband dies? She snapped. You think money just organizes itself? I did what needed to be done. For all of you. That's not true, Chloe whispered. You did it for Daniel. Mom turned her head slowly toward her, and I swear the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Excuse me. You always gave him everything, Chloe said, her voice trembling but steady. Dad's tools, the workshop, his car, the money, everything. And you told us we weren't responsible enough to handle anything. You made us feel like we were burdens. For a second, I saw something flicker across Mom's face. Guilt. Maybe, but then it hardened again. That's because you were children, she said. Daniel had ambition. He carried the family name forward. You two just existed. Daniel's jaw clenched. Mom, stop. Don't talk to them like that. Her eyes snapped to him, surprised. Oh, now you're defending them, she said with a bitter laugh. After everything I've done for you. What you've done, I said, was pit us against each other. You made us think we had to earn your approval. You manipulated us. Don't you dare use that word with me, she hissed. Her hands were shaking now, but not from weakness. This was fury. I kept this family together while you were off pretending you knew better. I worked, I paid bills, I gave Daniel a chance to succeed. By stealing from us, I interrupted. That did it. She slammed her hand down on the table, so hard the silverware rattled. Watch your tone, Joseph, she shouted. You don't understand what I sacrificed. And that's when Daniel said something that made the entire house go silent. Mom, he said quietly, did you take the money from Joe and Chloe's shares and use it for me? She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes darted to the stack of papers like she was looking for a way out. It wasn't stealing, she finally said. It was reallocating. You needed that money for the business. How else were you supposed to build something for this family? Daniel just stared at her. His face was pale, the same expression I remembered from when Dad died. The look of someone realizing their world wasn't what they thought it was. You told me it was from a separate account, he said slowly. You said it was from Dad's life insurance, not the inheritance. Mom didn't deny it. She just pressed her lips together. I could feel the anger rising in me like a tide I couldn't stop. You lied to both of us, I said. You made me think Daniel was selfish, and you made him think he earned it. You've been pulling the strings the whole time. I did what was best for this family, she repeated, voice trembling now, almost hysterical. If I hadn't done what I did, we'd all be out on the street. No, Mom, Chloe said quietly. You just didn't want to lose control. That stopped her. She turned to Chloe, eyes narrowing. Excuse me. Chloe's hands were gripping her napkin so tightly her knuckles were white. You say you did everything for us, but you don't even see us as people. You see us as extensions of you. You wanted to keep us dependent, so you'd always be the one in charge. For a long moment, Mom just stared at her. Then she let out a low, bitter laugh. You think you know me, little girl? You think you understand what real responsibility looks like? I understand enough, Chloe said, voice shaking but firm. I understand that you took our future and gave it to someone else. Daniel suddenly pushed his chair back and stood up. That's enough. I'm calling Uncle Ray. He was Dad's lawyer. He'll know how to fix this. Mom's face twisted. You're not calling anyone, she snapped, lunging forward to grab his arm. But Daniel pulled back, glaring at her. Why, Mom, he said. Why lie? You could have told us the truth. We could have worked it out. Her voice cracked. Because I knew you wouldn't understand, she said, her hands trembling. You would have left me like your father did. That sentence hit like a slap. What do you mean? I asked slowly. She froze. Chloe whispered, what do you mean like Dad did? The air in the room seemed to thicken. Mom looked at us, her mouth opening and closing like she couldn't decide whether to speak or not. Finally, she said, your father didn't die in that accident the way you think he did. He left us before that. I felt my stomach drop. What are you talking about? She took a shaky breath. He was going to divorce me, she said quietly. He was tired of holding everything together. He said I was too controlling. Her tone dripped with bitterness. So I told him if he left, he'd lose everything. The house, the workshop, even you three. I wasn't going to let him abandon us. Chloe covered her mouth. Daniel took a step back, eyes wide. Mom, what did you do? She shook her head quickly. Nothing. I didn't do anything. He had that crash a week later, and I lost everything. Everything. The silence that followed was unbearable. I couldn't breathe. My father hadn't just died. He'd been planning to leave. And Mom knew. She'd kept that from us our entire lives. Daniel turned away, his hands shaking. You're unbelievable, he whispered. You lied about Dad. You lied about the money. What else did you lie about? Mom's expression shifted from panic to coldness in an instant. Don't talk to me like that. I did what I had to. Your father was selfish. He didn't care about this family the way I did. He didn't control us, I said, my voice low. That's the difference. Something in her eyes snapped then. She pointed at me, her hand trembling with rage. You think you're so much better than me? You wouldn't last a day in my shoes. You all sit there judging me, but you have no idea what it takes to keep a family together. Together? Daniel shot back. You tore us apart. The argument spiraled from there. Voices overlapping, accusations flying. Years of resentment poured out in minutes. Chloe crying, Daniel shouting, me trying to get through to Mom while she screamed over us. And then, suddenly, she went quiet, completely still, her gaze fixed on Daniel. You're ungrateful, she said softly. All of you are. I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me. She turned toward the doorway and said, in that same eerie calm voice she'd used before, well, since you're all here, it's time you see what I've been protecting. She walked toward her office, and something about the way she moved, slow, deliberate, like she'd been planning this, made the hair on my arm stand up. Daniel glanced at me. What does that mean? But before I could answer, Mom came back holding a small, locked metal box. She set it down on the table with a dull thud. You wanted the truth? She said. Fine. You'll have it. I didn't know what was in that box, but I knew, deep down, that whatever she was about to show us would change everything. And I was right. I remember the moment I touched that metal box like it was yesterday, even though it's been months. The cold metal pressed against my palm, and my chest tightened with a mix of dread and anger. Mom stood there, smiling that strange, self-satisfied smile, as if she'd orchestrated some grand reveal. Daniel and Chloe were frozen, both staring at her as though she'd grown a second head. I didn't know what was inside the box, but the way she said, you'll have it, made my skin crawl. I didn't open it right away. I sat back, trying to collect my thoughts while Mom lingered, clearly enjoying the tension she'd built. Go ahead, she said finally, tilting her head. See for yourself. Inside were stacks of old bank statements, deeds, and legal documents, all showing how she had moved money around over the years. There were ledgers detailing Daniel's business expenses, which were suspiciously padded with money that had been meant for Chloe and me. And then, at the bottom, a folder labeled Joe and Chloe, restricted with my father's signature and dates from years before. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside, there were letters from Dad, never sent, expressing disappointment and warning Mom that she shouldn't manipulate us. Joe and Chloe must have their inheritance intact, one note said. They must have the chance to live independently. There was also a ledger with exact amounts taken from my and Chloe's portions, transferred to Daniel's account under the guise of investment in family future. I stared at the papers, my stomach churning. Mom had literally stolen from us to control the family. Daniel looked like he was about to pass out. I didn't know, he muttered. His voice cracked. Chloe just sat silently, tears streaking her cheeks. Mom's smile never wavered. See? You don't understand what it takes to manage a family. I did what I had to do. I slammed the box shut, shaking with fury. You didn't manage anything. You destroyed trust. You destroyed us. She shrugged. I gave you life. Don't thank me, just accept it. That night, I left. I didn't say goodbye to Mom. I barely looked at Daniel and Chloe. I drove through the quiet streets, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. I couldn't believe I'd been living under the shadow of her manipulation for so long. Everything I thought I knew about my family, about fairness, about Mom's love, was a lie. I didn't go back to that house for weeks. Chloe called a few times, but she was still living there, trapped in Mom's sphere. Daniel seemed to be avoiding me too, probably processing his own betrayal. I was angry, yes, but beneath the anger was this deep, hollow feeling, like my foundation had been pulled out from under me. I felt alone in a way I hadn't since Dad passed. It was at that lowest point, sitting in my empty apartment with a half-eaten pizza and a stack of unopened bills, that I realized something. I had spent so much of my life reacting to Mom, letting her control how I felt, how I lived, that I had never truly lived for myself. My career was stable but uninspired. My relationships were superficial because I was constantly wary of being manipulated or abandoned. If I stayed in that spiral, Mom would win, no matter what she'd done. So I started small. I got rid of old debts I'd been avoiding, set up new accounts that Mom couldn't access, and began researching investments, not just for money, but for independence. I signed up for online courses to sharpen my IT skills, expanding my freelance work into consulting. It wasn't overnight, but slowly, I began to feel the old spark of self-worth I hadn't realized I'd lost. I also started documenting everything. Every conversation, every suspicious email from Mom, every ledger or paper Daniel had access to. I wasn't sure what I would do with it yet, but I knew one day it would matter. For now, it was just about reclaiming my life. Chloe finally managed to move out a few months later. She got a small apartment near her grad school, and we started talking more openly. For the first time in years, we could discuss Mom without fear. Daniel, meanwhile, struggled with guilt. He admitted he'd suspected something was off with his account, but had trusted Mom blindly. He seemed almost paralyzed by it. During this time, I began to realize the scope of what Mom had done, not just financially, but emotionally. Every argument she'd sparked, every lie she'd told, had been a tool to keep us under her thumb. And now, with Chloe out and Daniel facing reality, her control was slipping. I threw myself into work and personal growth like my life depended on it, because it did. I started seeing opportunities I'd ignored before. I connected with colleagues who became mentors, and my freelance work began generating more than I'd ever earned at my old full-time job. I even started volunteering for a local tech nonprofit, helping underprivileged kids learn coding. The irony wasn't lost on me. After years of being manipulated, I was finally in control. But the more I succeeded, the more I realized something else. Mom would not go down quietly. I started noticing little things, strange calls, vague emails, coincidental sightings near my office. She was testing me, trying to see if I'd fall back into her orbit. I didn't, but the knowledge that she was still scheming, still watching, made every victory feel incomplete. The tipping point came one evening when I received an unexpected email from Mom, carefully worded, filled with guilt-laced undertones about family, loyalty, and sacrifice. "I only ever wanted what was best for all of you," it said. "I hope you understand someday." I read it twice, then deleted it. Understanding wasn't the issue. I would never understand, because she had chosen manipulation over honesty. But I realized something crucial. If I let her keep thinking she had power, she would never stop. And that's when the seed of revenge took root. Not out of anger, not out of spite, but because I had spent decades being pushed, controlled, and lied to. Now, I wanted the truth to be acknowledged. I wanted justice, not violence, but justice that would make her realize she couldn't control us anymore. So I began planning quietly. Small steps at first, securing my finances, researching legal avenues, consulting experts who could help me untangle Mom's manipulations. I reached out to an attorney, framing it as a simple inquiry about estate laws and my rights as a beneficiary. I didn't mention Mom's schemes yet. I needed facts, documentation, proof that couldn't be denied. Meanwhile, I rebuilt my personal life. I reconnected with old friends, started dating again, and even traveled a little. Each new experience was like reclaiming a piece of myself Mom had tried to suppress. I was learning not only to survive, but to thrive. I began to see the outlines of the life I could have, independent of her shadow. Chloe and I started meeting regularly to review our family history, our father's intentions, and Mom's manipulations. Daniel joined reluctantly, still grappling with his own guilt. We realized that Mom hadn't just taken money. She had shaped every perception, every interaction, to keep us off balance. It was subtle but brilliant in a horrifying way. One night, while going through old papers, Chloe paused and said something that hit me like a punch. "Joe, she's been preparing for this moment for years. That Christmas dinner? The box? She wanted us to see it all at once, so we'd fight, so we'd fracture, so we'd be easy to control again." I nodded slowly, feeling the cold clarity of truth settle over me. "She's been playing a long game," I said, "and we're only just beginning to understand it." That realization was both terrifying and empowering. Terrifying because it reminded me that Mom's manipulations were far from over. Empowering because it meant that, for the first time, I could plan a move she wouldn't anticipate. Not out of rage, but with precision. I began envisioning the steps I would take to reclaim what she had stolen, to finally level the playing field. I wasn't the same Joe who had walked into that house that Christmas night. That version had been naive, trusting, and reactive. This Joe was careful, strategic, and patient. I understood now that to defeat Mom, I had to think like her, but better. And so began my quiet rise. Every promotion, every financial maneuver, every bit of personal growth was a step in a larger plan. I kept it invisible, subtle, under the radar. To anyone else, it looked like I was just living my life. To me, every achievement was a piece of the foundation I was building for the moment when Mom's control would finally crumble. But even as I strengthened myself, I knew the moment of reckoning was coming. Mom wouldn't wait forever. She was the kind of person who, when cornered, would strike back with all she had. And I had to be ready. I had hit rock bottom that Christmas night, staring at that metal box and realizing how thoroughly my family had been manipulated. But now, months later, I was rising from the ashes. Stronger, wiser, patient. I had a plan, and every day I took steps to make sure it would succeed. The months that followed my quiet rise were, in many ways, the most intense and exhilarating of my life. I was no longer the reactive, naive Joe who had stormed out of Mom's house that Christmas. I had rebuilt myself, piece by piece, brick by brick, and now I was ready to start laying the groundwork for the reckoning I knew was coming. But unlike Mom, I wasn't rushing. I had learned from her mistakes, the chaos, the emotion, the brash moves that ultimately left you exposed. This would be precise, calculated, and undeniable. The first step was intelligence. I needed to know everything about Mom's current life, her finances, her network, her habits. Daniel had been useful here, though reluctantly. He'd started asking questions about Mom's investments after our initial fallout, and I quietly guided him toward observing patterns rather than confronting her directly. Chloe helped too. She was living independently now, free from Mom's immediate influence, and she had started noticing little inconsistencies in Mom's stories, small things she had previously shrugged off. Together, the three of us became a quiet investigative team, documenting everything. I began revisiting the metal box from that Christmas night. Each document, ledger, and note became a clue. I traced transfers, looked at old contracts, and even dug into Mom's current financial statements, which I obtained through careful research and discreet legal inquiries. I was methodical. Every phone call she made, every check she wrote, every investment she touted as for the family, I cross-checked it against records. I learned things I hadn't imagined. She had set up multiple trusts, hidden accounts under minor relatives' names, and even invested some of Daniel's money in speculative ventures she personally controlled. If one thing was clear, it was that she had been orchestrating the family's finances like a puppeteer for decades, and she still thought she could do it unnoticed. But I didn't just stop at finances. I needed to understand her psychology, her habits, her triggers, her weaknesses. She had a particular way of responding when she thought someone was doubting her competence, when she felt underappreciated, when her control was challenged. I had seen the reactions firsthand, the tightening jaw, the short, clipped breaths, the sudden intensity in her eyes. I began keeping notes, not to obsess, but to create a map. Understanding how she operated meant I could anticipate her moves, and more importantly, manipulate her perceptions the way she had manipulated ours for so long. Next came allies. I realized quickly that Daniel, for all his guilt, was not entirely useful unless I framed our actions carefully. He was still Mom's favorite and had a hard time fully accepting her deceit, though he had begun questioning it more each day. Chloe, on the other hand, was a perfect ally, observant, meticulous, and cautious. Together, we started compiling all of the evidence: bank statements, emails, letters, contracts, and photographs. Every scrap of proof that could illustrate not just her manipulations, but her deliberate favoritism and outright theft. I also began strengthening my position in ways Mom would never suspect. I expanded my freelance business into a small consultancy, quietly taking clients I knew would generate long-term contracts. I invested in accounts she couldn't touch, set up legal protections for assets, and even discreetly secured a lawyer who specialized in estate law and family disputes, but one I could approach as a hypothetical scenario. Mom would never know that I was preparing for the moment when every document and action would have consequences. Socially, I started planting subtle narratives. I spoke to family friends, longtime neighbors, and even distant relatives about my accomplishments and financial independence. Not bragging, not flaunting, just casually mentioning details that suggested I was thriving outside her influence. Mom had always relied on our perceived dependence to maintain her control. By quietly undermining that narrative, I began to remove one of her key levers, the illusion that she held all the power. The next phase was timing. I had learned from past confrontations with Mom that rushing led to disaster. She thrived on emotion, on immediate reactions, and on chaos. The moment I chose to confront her, or allow others to confront her, had to be perfect. I needed an environment where her pride, her ego, and her carefully cultivated reputation would amplify the impact of her exposure. Something public, something undeniable, something that would leave no room for her to deflect or rewrite the story. It came to me almost naturally. Our family's annual reunion at the lake house, a tradition Mom prided herself on as the glue of the family, was the perfect stage. Everyone would be present: distant relatives, family friends, even some local business contacts who respected Mom publicly. It was a weekend Mom had spent decades perfecting, with meticulous schedules, meals, and orchestrated social dynamics. She would be in her element, confident and commanding. And yet, that confidence made her vulnerable. She would underestimate the precision and planning I had put into this. In the weeks leading up to the reunion, I started setting the pieces in place. I invited a trusted family attorney under the pretense of reviewing some old documents, making sure they were discreetly available if needed. I coordinated with Chloe and Daniel on signals, on cues, and on how to subtly direct conversations without alerting Mom that we were aware of her schemes. We even rehearsed reactions to potential denials, lies, or manipulations, ensuring that we would remain calm, collected, and undeniably factual. Simultaneously, I nurtured a subtle narrative of success that Mom couldn't ignore. I increased my visibility in our small community's business circles, attended events that she frequented, and quietly ensured that my professional accomplishments were visible. She had always relied on the illusion of control. If I could erode her image while she was at her most proud, the impact would be catastrophic. The most difficult part, surprisingly, wasn't the planning or the documentation, it was patience. I wanted to see her crumble immediately, to confront her with the injustice she had wrought, but I had to restrain myself. Every text, every phone call, every casual remark had to be measured. I couldn't afford a single misstep. I kept reminding myself, this wasn't about revenge in the heat of anger. It was about orchestrating a revelation so thorough, so undeniable, that her influence and control would evaporate in front of everyone. One evening, a week before the reunion, I sat in my apartment reviewing the final checklist. Documents were organized chronologically, highlighting every instance of favoritism, every financial misallocation, every lie. I had letters from Dad, ledger sheets, bank statements, and even witness statements from distant relatives who had noticed anomalies over the years. Chloe had organized visual aids, making the evidence easy to understand at a glance. Daniel was on board, though still uneasy. He had begun to fully grasp Mom's manipulations and was ready to support our approach. The adrenaline had begun to build. I wasn't scared, not really. I was exhilarated. After years of being trapped in Mom's orbit, I finally had the upper hand. And yet, a part of me remained cautious. Mom was clever. She had survived countless challenges before, always emerging with control intact. One false move, one miscalculated reveal, and the plan could backfire spectacularly. But I had the patience, the preparation, and the evidence. And most importantly, I had the unity of my siblings, finally aware, finally willing, finally ready. Together, we were no longer vulnerable. We were prepared. On the day of the reunion, I arrived early, carrying a subtle, unassuming briefcase that contained the key documents. Chloe was already there, helping set up the living room in a casual, just another family gathering way. Daniel was pacing quietly, checking and double-checking details. Mom arrived last, radiant and oblivious, wearing her usual air of command. She greeted everyone warmly, unaware of the storm gathering quietly around her. As the evening unfolded, I maintained a calm, friendly demeanor. Conversations were casual, laughter filled the room, and Mom was in her element, sharing stories, directing activities, basking in the illusion of control. I watched her closely, noting how she interacted with everyone, how her pride radiated in her posture and speech. Every observation was fuel for the next step. Then, as planned, the moment approached. A subtle question from a distant cousin about family finances opened the door. Mom started answering confidently, as she always did, weaving her narrative of sacrifice and control. I waited, patiently. Chloe and Daniel knew the signal. And I knew, finally, that the time was almost right. The storm was coming. Mom had built her empire of lies over decades, but the foundation was brittle. And when the first domino fell, there would be no stopping the cascade. I could feel my heart rate quicken, but my hands remained steady. Every piece was in place, every ally aware, every document ready. The control she had clung to for so long was about to slip through her fingers, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The morning of the reunion, everything felt almost too calm. I arrived at the lake house before anyone else, the early sun reflecting off the water and casting a quiet, deceptive serenity across the property. I carried the briefcase with me like it was a normal piece of luggage, but inside it was the culmination of months of planning. Bank statements, letters from Dad, ledgers, photographs, and every piece of evidence Mom had tried so desperately to hide. This wasn't a moment for emotion, it was a moment for precision. Chloe and Daniel arrived shortly after, both tense but composed. Chloe had set up the living room so it looked casual. Family photos, snacks on the table, candles on the mantel. Everything normal. Mom arrived last, radiant as always, wearing the same air of authority she had cultivated for decades. She greeted everyone warmly, unaware that the entire dynamic of the room had already shifted. The reunion started like any other. Laughter, small talk, anecdotes about past holidays. Mom took the lead in orchestrating activities, moving from conversation to conversation with her practiced charm. I watched her carefully, noting every interaction, every flicker of pride or satisfaction. She had no idea that the evening would not end in her favor. The trigger came quietly. A distant cousin asked, almost casually, "So, how are the family finances looking these days? I remember Dad used to leave you all some savings." Mom's eyes lit up. She leaned forward eagerly, ready to spin her story, to remind everyone how much she had sacrificed and managed for us. This was perfect. I waited, patient, letting her weave her narrative, letting her pride build the walls she was about to crash into. When she finished, smiling at the room, I stood. My hands were calm, my voice steady. "Mom," I said, "I think it's time everyone saw exactly what's been going on." I set the briefcase down and opened it, spreading the documents across the table. The papers were carefully organized. First the letters from Dad, then the ledgers showing her diversion of funds, then the photographs and bank statements tying everything together. The room went quiet, the only sound the gentle lapping of water outside. Mom froze, her smile faltering. "Joe, what is this?" she asked, her voice trembling, a crack in her armor I had waited years to see. I looked at her evenly. "This is everything. Every lie, every manipulation, Every time you redirected money that belonged to Chloe and me to Daniel's account. Every time you convinced us we were unworthy or incapable. Every letter Dad wrote, warning you not to manipulate us. And now, everyone here can see it too. Chloe stepped forward, pulling out some of her own notes. We documented everything, Mom. Every time you tried to control us, every financial move you made that was deceptive. The evidence is overwhelming. Daniel, pale and shaking, added, I didn't realize the full extent. I trusted you blindly, Mom. I see now that you've been controlling all of us, not just me. Mom's eyes darted around the room. She had built her empire of lies, but now the foundation was crumbling. She stuttered, trying to regain control. You don't understand. I did all of this to protect the family, to keep us together. I shook my head. No, Mom. You did it to keep yourself in control. You weren't protecting anyone. You were playing puppet master. And it's done. Your control ends tonight. Her hands shook as she gestured wildly. I sacrificed everything. I worked for this family, and you destroyed it in the process, Chloe said calmly. Look at us. Do you think we feel grateful? You lied to Dad, you lied to us, and you stole from us. That's not sacrifice, that's manipulation. Mom tried to interject, but I held up a hand. The evidence speaks for itself. We've double-checked everything. All accounts, all ledgers, all letters. Everyone here can see what you did. You're not a matriarch. You're a manipulator. At that moment, I saw something shift in the room. Family friends and distant relatives had begun to lean in, reading over the documents, whispering among themselves. The murmurs grew, then spread. The web of deceit Mom had spun was laid bare, visible to everyone she thought she had influence over. Her voice grew louder, desperate. No, you can't prove anything. This isn't fair. I've been the one holding this family together. Daniel finally spoke, his voice firm. You weren't holding it together, Mom. You were controlling it. And now it's time for you to face the consequences. I picked up the final folder, Dad's letters, and handed it to a family friend who had known him for decades. Read these. Every word, every warning. See for yourself what she did, what she manipulated, and what she tried to hide from us all. The friend's hands trembled as he read. Joe, Chloe, Daniel, this is shocking. I had no idea. Mom's face turned a deep, unnatural red. She tried to snatch the folder back, but the friend held it steady. For the first time in decades, she realized she had no control over the room, over us, over the narrative. Then came the most satisfying moment. I calmly addressed the entire room, voice steady, deliberate. Mom has spent her life manipulating us, controlling every aspect of our family, and hiding her actions behind claims of sacrifice. Tonight, everyone here has seen the truth. She no longer has control. And from this moment forward, we are free from her influence. The weight of that statement hung in the air. Mom's hands fell to her sides. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, her eyes darting around like she was searching for an escape route that didn't exist. For years, she had believed herself untouchable. Tonight, that illusion was shattered. Chloe looked at me and nodded. I could see the relief and empowerment on her face. Daniel, still pale, seemed to have aged years in minutes, the weight of his own complicity pressing down on him. But he nodded too. He was ready to step out from under Mom's shadow. Mom finally sank into a chair, slumping as though the very air had been pulled from her lungs. You can't just take everything away from me, she said weakly. I did it for the family. I stepped closer, calm, precise. No, Mom, you can't manipulate the past, but you can accept responsibility. And from this point forward, the family you tried to control will decide how to move forward without you. The room was silent for a long moment. Then, one by one, family members began to acknowledge what had happened. Friends who had respected her, neighbors who had admired her dedication, they all looked at her differently now. The image she had carefully crafted over decades had crumbled in an instant. Mom's eyes welled with tears, but they weren't tears of redemption. They were tears of realization, of power lost, of pride destroyed, of manipulation exposed. I watched her, a strange mixture of pity and satisfaction swelling inside me. Chloe placed a hand on my shoulder. It's over, she whispered. I nodded. It was over. Daniel finally spoke, voice quiet but firm. Mom, I don't know what will happen now, but we're not going to be your puppets anymore. We're done being afraid of you. Mom made a small, defeated sound, almost a whimper, and buried her face in her hands. For the first time, I realized just how completely she had lost. There was no yelling, no pleading, no dramatic reversal. Just silence. Just the acknowledgement that her power was gone. I looked around the room at everyone who had witnessed the revelation. The friends, the relatives, Chloe, Daniel. The atmosphere had shifted. No more fear. No more manipulation. No more lies. We had taken back the narrative, the control, and the dignity that Mom had tried to steal. I closed the briefcase, feeling the weight of all those months of planning settle into a quiet satisfaction. This wasn't about vengeance in the traditional sense. It was about truth, clarity, and finally reclaiming the life and family that had been overshadowed for so long. Mom looked up at me once, her eyes searching, perhaps for a hint of forgiveness, a sign that this could be undone. I shook my head gently. "There's no undoing it," I said, "only moving forward. And from now on, the family moves forward without lies." She slumped back, silent, and for the first time in decades, the room felt free. Not just Chloe and Daniel and me, but everyone who had once been subject to her control. The tension that had hung over the family for years dissipated, replaced with clarity and resolve. I glanced at Chloe and Daniel, and for a moment, I allowed myself a small smile. It had taken patience, strategy, and courage, but the moment had come. The empire of lies was gone, and in its place stood truth, integrity, and freedom. And as I looked at Mom, finally defeated, I realized something profound. Power taken by manipulation is always temporary. And the family that rebuilds itself on honesty and strength, that lasts forever. For the first time in my life, I felt completely free. And I knew, without a doubt, that this was only the beginning of a better life. One we would build on our own terms, untangled from the shadows of her control. The empire of lies had fallen, and we were standing tall in its place. The chapter was closed.